I can still remember the first time I heard the name Gatsby. It was at one of the endless summer parties Daisy and I attended, the kind of event where the rich and idle come together, if only to pass the time. To most of us, Gatsby was just another name, another eccentric millionaire with a mansion full of guests and no apparent purpose in life other than to flaunt his wealth. I couldn't have known then how deep this man would come to affect me, and how he would, in the end, tear apart something I thought was perfect. That evening, Daisy was restless, as she often was in those days, searching for something to distract her from the hollow comfort of our own lives. I, on the other hand, had always found satisfaction in the stability that money and power provided. Daisy, my wife, was the quintessential image of grace and beauty, but there was an unspoken yearning in her that I had never been able to quiet. She was the type of woman who could never settle, and for all the beauty and status I provided her, it wasn't enough. When we arrived at Gatsby's estate, there was an air of mystery about it. The mansion was like a towering monument to the American dream, its lights casting long shadows over the manicured lawn. But beneath the gleaming exterior, I sensed something off. There was something too polished about it all, too perfect. Everything was orchestrated in such a way that it made me uneasy. A man doesn't build a life like that without cutting corners or making sacrifices, and I could see that Gatsby was no different. Daisy seemed enthralled by it, her eyes lighting up as she took in the opulence, but there was something more to it. She wasn't just fascinated by the wealth, she was drawn to the mystery of Gatsby. And that's when I first felt it, the sharp sting of jealousy. I had known Daisy for years, and though our marriage was far from perfect, I had always thought of her as mine. But here was a man who made her feel something that I hadn't felt in years, something I wasn't sure I could give her anymore. Gatsby, of course, wasn't there at first. He never was. It was always his guests who filled the rooms, who danced, who talked in hushed voices about their mysterious host. We were introduced to a few people, some I recognized from our circles, others I didn't, but the absence of Gatsby was conspicuous. It was as if his presence lingered even when he wasn't physically there, like the ghost of someone who had crafted an empire out of thin air. It was only when the night wore on and the lights dimmed that Gatsby finally appeared. He stepped into the room like a man who knew everyone was watching, and yet he made no grand entrance. His clothing was impeccable, his manner easy but deliberate. He was tall, but not in the way that made him intimidating. He had a face that was familiar, yet you could never quite place where you had seen it before. There was something in his smile, however, something that gave away the fact that he had built this life from nothing, a smile that was too confident, too practiced. It was a smile that said, "I am here, and I have arrived." I could see the way Daisy reacted to him. Her eyes followed him as he walked through the crowd, her gaze lingering a little too long. I could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed in her, and I couldn't ignore it. Gatsby was a stranger, yet there was something about him that drew people in, made them want to know him, to be near him, the way he carried himself, the way he spoke. It was clear he had some kind of magnetism, an energy that others couldn't help but be drawn to. I, of course, was unimpressed. As far as I was concerned, Gatsby was just another rich man who thought he could buy his way into the lives of the old moneyed elite. I had worked hard for everything I had, and I wasn't about to let some self-made man come in and steal the attention of my wife. Daisy, for all her charm and beauty, had always been mine, and I was determined to keep it that way. As the night wore on, I watched Gatsby from a distance, trying to gauge what it was about him that made him so magnetic. He wasn't particularly striking, not in the traditional sense. His mannerisms were polished, but not overly refined. There was a ruggedness to him, something raw beneath the surface that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And that, I think, was what unsettled me most. He didn't belong here, but he had made himself belong. Daisy was the first to approach him. They exchanged pleasantries, and for a moment, I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. Gatsby's charm was undeniable. I could see it in the way he spoke to her, in the way his eyes locked onto hers, with a confidence that I couldn't replicate. In that moment, I realized something that I had been trying to avoid. I was no longer the center of Daisy's world. Gatsby had taken my place. And in that realization, I felt a spark of something inside me, something that was far too familiar. It was jealousy, of course, but it was more than that. It was fear. Fear that I had already lost Daisy, that my wealth, my power, and my position in society meant nothing compared to what Gatsby could offer her. In that moment, I knew that Gatsby wasn't just a man who wanted Daisy. He was a man who would stop at nothing to take her from me, and I would have to stop him. The more I watched Gatsby that night, the more certain I became that he wasn't just another man. He wasn't like the others who came to our parties, those who were just looking for entertainment, fleeting pleasures, or the chance to be seen with the right people. No, Gatsby had a different kind of presence. His eyes locked onto Daisy's, as though nothing else in the room mattered. And in that moment, I understood something I had never allowed myself to fully acknowledge. Gatsby was here for one thing, and one thing only. Daisy Buchanan. I could see the way she responded to him. The way her laughter became lighter, more genuine, as though she were remembering something buried deep within her. It infuriated me, but I kept my composure. Daisy had always been the prize, the object of desire in our little world, and I was her rightful owner. I had spent years building the life that allowed me to claim her as mine. I had earned her, even if she didn't always show the same devotion I showed her. And now this Manthis Gatsby was attempting to disrupt that balance. But it wasn't just his presence that unnerved me, it was the way people spoke about him. The whispers that ran through the crowd, the awe in their voices. They didn't know him, not really, yet they treated him as if he were one of them, one of us. It was almost as if they had forgotten that I, Tom Buchanan, was their peer, their equal. I wasn't some outsider like Gatsby. I had the wealth, the status, the name. I had Daisy. But Gatsby, he was an enigma, a man who had risen from nothing, and that made him dangerous. As the evening wore on, I felt myself growing increasingly restless. Daisy, as usual, was caught up in the excitement, fluttering around, laughing with Gatsby as though she had known him for years. It wasn't just the fact that she was enjoying his company, it was the way she seemed to be swept up by him, drawn into his orbit like a moth to a flame. The more I watched, the more I could feel the invisible barrier between us begin to rise. I leaned in, close enough to hear their conversation, though they didn't notice me standing there. Gatsby was saying something about the past, about their time together. Daisy responded with a smile, but I could see the hint of sadness in her eyes, as though she were remembering something she had tried to forget. It was all too much to bear. I had to intervene. I couldn't let this man, this upstart, come in and take what was rightfully mine. Daisy was mine. I had given her everything. I had protected her, sheltered her from the realities of the world. Gatsby didn't understand that. He didn't understand what it took to build a life, a family, a reputation. He was just a man with a dream, and those kinds of men never ended up with the woman they wanted. "Nick," I said, walking over to the bar where my cousin was standing, "I want to have a word with our friend Gatsby. He seems to be getting a little too comfortable, doesn't he?" Nick, always the quiet one, glanced up at me, his eyes narrowing as he took in my tone, but he didn't say anything. I could see that he, too, had started to question the man. Gatsby wasn't like us, and that was the problem. I turned back to find Gatsby and Daisy, but when I saw them again, they were no longer standing together. Daisy was laughing, yes, but I could see that the smile on her face was not the same as before. The warmth, the connection was gone. She had already started to drift away, but I knew she wasn't yet lost. Not entirely. As I approached, Gatsby turned his attention to me. For a moment I thought he might back down, but then he smiled, cool and confident. Too confident. "Mr. Buchanan," he said, extending his hand, "it's a pleasure to meet you." I took his hand, but the touch felt nothing like the handshake of a man who would become my equal. It was a handshake between two men who stood on different planes of existence. One of us had built his world with hard work, inheritance, and blood. The other had crafted his out of sheer willpower and an unshakable obsession with a woman who had no real place in his life. "You seem to be enjoying yourself," I said, forcing a smile. "But I wonder, Gatsby, do you know exactly what you're doing?" He blinked, and for the first time that night I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but only for a moment. He recovered quickly, that practiced smile returning to his face. "I'm merely here to enjoy the company, Tom," he replied smoothly, as though I had no reason to be concerned. "Just like you." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You're not just here for company, old sport. You're here for something much more important than that." He smiled again, and this time I could see the tension behind his eyes. He knew what I meant, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not with Daisy so close. "Daisy's happiness is what matters most to me," he said, his voice low, almost as if it were a confession. I could see that, for all his confidence, he was vulnerable. His eyes flicked briefly toward Daisy, and I knew in that moment that he was hanging on to a thread. He wanted something he couldn't have. He wanted a dream, a woman who had already moved on with her life, and that I would never allow. I didn't need to say any more. Gatsby and I both knew what was at stake. He was playing a dangerous game, and I wasn't going to let him win, not without a fight. After that encounter with Gatsby, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I had been around men like him before, men who built their wealth from the ground up, men who lived by their wits and charm rather than by their birthright. They were the kind of men who thought they could change the world by sheer force of will. But there was something different about Gatsby, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and it unsettled me in a way I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I watched him more closely. I saw the way he moved through our world so effortlessly, so comfortably, as though he belonged. And yet, when I looked closer, I realized something. Gatsby was a stranger to us all. He didn't belong here. He wasn't part of our world. And yet he had inserted himself into it with such determination that it was hard to imagine it without him. It made my blood boil to think that someone who had built his life from nothing could come in and disrupt the careful, measured world that Daisy and I had spent years constructing. It wasn't just his wealth that bothered me. It was the way he used it, the way he flaunted it like a trophy. Gatsby wasn't like me. I had earned my place in the world through birth and privilege. My family had always been wealthy, always had a reputation. I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But Gatsby, he was trying to prove something. To himself, to Daisy, to everyone who had ever looked down on him. And in that process, he was willing to sacrifice anything, even the truth. It was then that I began to understand the depth of his obsession with Daisy. It wasn't just about love, it was about possession. Gatsby wasn't in love with Daisy as she was. He was in love with the idea of her, the image of her that he had crafted in his mind. She was the symbol of everything he had ever wanted: wealth, beauty, and status. And he was determined to make her a part of his perfect world. But Daisy was already part of mine. She belonged to me, and I was not about to let some stranger with a shiny car and a mysterious past take her away. That evening, as I watched Gatsby and Daisy from across the room, I could see how much they meant to each other. The way they looked at each other like nothing else in the world mattered. But there was something more. Daisy didn't just look at Gatsby with affection. There was a spark of something deeper, something that spoke to the past they shared, to a time before Tom Buchanan came into the picture. That thought gnawed at me. I had built my life on the belief that Daisy and I were a perfect match, that we were meant to be together. But Gatsby had come to challenge that belief, and for the first time, I wondered if I was enough for her. As the weeks passed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Gatsby was everywhere at our parties, at our gatherings, always lurking in the background, always watching. He was a constant presence in Daisy's life, and I couldn't stand it. Every time I looked at him, I felt a surge of anger, of resentment. This man, this Gatsby, was pretending to be something he was not, trying to claim a place in a world that wasn't his to take. He was an imposter, and I was determined to expose him for what he really was. I started to dig deeper into his past, to uncover whatever secrets he was hiding. The more I learned, the more certain I became that Gatsby was nothing more than a product of his own delusion. He had built his wealth through unscrupulous means, through shady business deals and criminal activity. He wasn't the self-made man he pretended to be. He was a liar, a fraud. But I couldn't let Daisy see that. I couldn't let her know the truth. She had already fallen for his charm, his mystery, and if I showed her the man behind the mask, I risked losing her forever. So I kept my distance, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to confront him. That moment came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, Daisy and I were having lunch when Gatsby showed up uninvited, as he often did. His presence had become a constant disruption in our lives, and I could feel the tension building between us. I could see the way Daisy's eyes lingered on him, the way she seemed to be drawn to him even though she knew she shouldn't be. It made my blood boil. I walked over to him, my hand clenched into a fist, and without thinking I confronted him. "What is it you want, Gatsby?" I asked, my voice low and steady. Gatsby looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "I want Daisy, Tom," he said, his voice even, "and I intend to have her." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. My heart raced, and I could feel my temper rising. I had to remind myself that this wasn't just about Daisy anymore. This was about everything I had built, about everything that was mine. "You'll never have her," I said, my voice steady despite the fury bubbling up inside me. "Daisy is mine, and she always will be." He smiled, a little too confidently, and in that moment, I knew Gatsby didn't just want Daisy. He wanted to destroy everything I had, and I wasn't about to let him do it. The moment hung between us, thick with tension. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath coming in short bursts. I had never been so close to losing control before. In that moment, I knew that Gatsby and I were on a collision course, and there was no avoiding the inevitable. Daisy stood beside me, silent, watching the two of us. She knew, as I did, that everything had been leading to this moment, the showdown between us, the fight for her heart, and ultimately, the fight for what each of us believed we were entitled to. Gatsby's smile was a facade, one that barely hid the burning determination in his eyes. "I don't want to cause trouble, Tom," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm, like a man trying to keep his emotions in check. "But Daisy deserves more than what you've given her. She deserves more than this life. He gestured vaguely toward our home, toward the gold and opulence that I had worked so hard to build. The same gold and opulence that he could never have. I laughed, but it was bitter. More? I scoffed. She's had everything she's ever needed. What could you possibly offer her that I haven't already given her? This house, the cars, the servants. You think your money can replace the life we've built together? Daisy remained silent, and it cut me deeper than anything Gatsby could have said. She wasn't defending me, nor was she defending him. She was merely standing there, caught between the two of us, unable or unwilling to choose. And in that silence I felt something shift inside me. The rage I had been holding back for so long began to surface, and I could feel my control slipping. Gatsby wasn't just fighting for Daisy, he was fighting for something much deeper, something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. He was fighting for a version of Daisy that I had never known, a version of her that existed only in his mind. And I realized with a sickening clarity that I couldn't compete with that version of her. You think you can just step into our lives, Gatsby? I said, my voice a little louder now. You think you can take her away from me? You're not even a part of this world. You never will be. Gatsby's expression softened, but only slightly. He wasn't angry, not in the way I was. Instead, there was pity in his eyes. You don't understand, he said quietly. This is about more than just wealth or status. It's about love, Tom. Real love. The kind of love that can't be bought or sold. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I could feel my blood boiling, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew if I let myself go completely, if I let this anger consume me, I would lose everything. And yet there was something in his words that gnawed at me, something that made me question everything I had believed about love, about Daisy, about myself. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice now cold and hard. This is about love. But you don't know what it means to love someone. You think you can just sweep her off her feet, take her away from me? You're wrong. Daisy isn't some prize you get to win. She's my wife. And no matter how many times you show up at my door, no matter how many times you throw your parties, she will always choose me. Always. Gatsby didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to Daisy, his gaze softening. There was something vulnerable in his eyes, something raw. For the first time, I saw him not as the man who had everything, but as a man who had nothing at all. He had built his entire life around one singular goal, getting Daisy back. And in doing so, he had lost sight of everything else, his wealth, his mansion, his empire. It all meant nothing in the face of this one singular obsession, and I realized with a sudden clarity that he would never stop, not until he had her. Daisy finally spoke, her voice shaky. Tom! Her eyes darted between Gatsby and me. I don't want this. I don't want to hurt anyone. She was torn. I could see it in her eyes, the conflict, the confusion. She didn't know how to navigate the mess we had created, and I could feel her slipping further away from me. No, Gatsby said softly, almost pleading. You don't have to hurt anyone, Daisy. You never have to choose between us. All I want is a chance to show you that I can give you the life you deserve. But Daisy shook her head, and I saw something in her eyes that made my heart sink. She wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure if she could live in the world I had created for her, if she could accept the life of luxury and security I had given her. She wasn't sure if the love we shared was enough to hold her here. "Please," I said, my voice low, almost desperate. "You can't let him win, Daisy. He's just a man with a dream. You know what we have is real. Don't throw it away." Gatsby took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away," he said softly. "I'm just asking you to be with me. To finally be happy." The tension in the room was unbearable. The air seemed thick, charged with the weight of what was at stake. Daisy stood between us, her back straight, her lips pressed into a thin line. I saw her take a deep breath, as though preparing herself to make a decision that would shape the rest of her life. But Daisy didn't speak. Instead, she turned to me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name: regret, love, uncertainty. She looked at me, then at Gatsby, and for a long moment the world stood still. And then she made her choice. In that moment, Daisy didn't speak. She didn't need to. I saw it in her eyes, the unspoken words, the hesitation. It was as if she were drowning in a sea of her own emotions, and there was no way to save her from the current pulling her under. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched her, every fiber of my being screaming at her to choose me, to choose the life we had built, the life I had sacrificed so much for. But I could feel it slipping away. I could feel the inevitability of the decision she was about to make, and it terrified me. The silence between us stretched out, unbearable and crushing. My eyes were locked on Daisy, watching for any sign, any movement, but there was nothing. Gatsby stood there too, waiting for something I couldn't name. Hope, perhaps. The same hope that had driven him to build this entire fantasy, this life built on dreams and illusions. His gaze was fixed on Daisy, but I could see it in his eyes. He was just as lost as she was. He was just as desperate. And then, without warning, she took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had fallen on her. She finally spoke, but her voice was soft, fragile, as if the very words she was about to say would break her. I can't," Daisy said, her voice trembling. "I can't leave Tom." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I thought I had already known the answer, but hearing her say it aloud with such finality tore through me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Everything I had believed in, everything I had fought for, felt like it was slipping away, unraveling before my eyes. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I stood there, paralyzed by her words, by the cold reality of what she had just chosen. Gatsby, standing just a few feet away, had gone completely still. The dream he had fought so hard for, the life he had worked to build for Daisy, was collapsing in front of him. And yet, despite the hurt that must have been twisting in his chest, he said nothing. For a brief moment, I almost felt pity for him. This man who had come into our lives like a storm, had thought he could change everything, had believed that love could conquer all. But love, like money, is fickle. It doesn't always work out the way you want it to. Gatsby had built this world for Daisy, but he could not make her choose him. And that was the cruelest irony of all. In the end, Daisy had chosen security, the life she knew, the man who, despite all his flaws, was her husband. She chose the stability of our world, the one that came with the privilege and power she had grown up with, even though it wasn't the same as the passionate, idealized version of love that Gatsby had offered her. Gatsby's face tightened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability in him, something raw, something human. His eyes flicked between Daisy and me, and for a moment I almost thought he would speak, would try to convince her again, but instead he turned away, his shoulders stiff with the weight of his defeat. Daisy took a step forward, reaching out to him, but he didn't respond. His back was to her, to all of us. His dream had shattered, and there was nothing left but the ruins. I could see the pain in Gatsby's eyes, but it was more than just love for Daisy. It was an understanding, a realization that the life he had tried to build was always going to be incomplete, that even the wealth, the mansion, the grand parties, everything he had done had been for a dream that was never meant to be. He wasn't just fighting for Daisy, he was fighting for a version of her that no longer existed. But I wasn't about to let him have her. I had worked too hard, built too much. Daisy was my wife, and as much as I hated to admit it, she was mine in ways that Gatsby would never understand. She had chosen me not because of love, perhaps, but because of the life I had provided her, a life of comfort, security, and social standing. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was the life Daisy knew. It was the life she could never leave behind. Gatsby, standing there in the garden, looked smaller now. The man who had once seemed so larger than life, so determined, had crumbled before us. The dream he had clung to for so long was gone, and in its place was just a man, broken and empty, staring at the love he could never have. I thought about Daisy again, how she had stood between us, torn, unable to fully choose. But in the end, she had made her decision. She had chosen the life she knew, the man she had already committed to, despite all the things that had gone wrong between us. I felt a bitter sense of victory, but it was hollow. Nothing about this moment felt like a win. As Gatsby walked away, Daisy remained standing there, her eyes glassy, distant. I could tell that even though she had made her choice, she would always wonder what could have been. The regret would never leave her. And so the world I had carefully crafted continued to spin. The parties would go on. The luxury would remain. But everything felt different now. We were all trapped in our own little worlds, unable to escape the past, unable to move forward. Gatsby had been right about one thing. Love was never as simple as it seemed. It wasn't just about wealth or status or even passion. Love was a lie, an illusion, a thing we chase forever without ever truly finding it. The days after the confrontation were nothing short of a blur. Daisy and I resumed our life as if nothing had happened, though I could feel the tension between us, thick in the air. It was clear to me that something had shifted in her. Perhaps it was the weight of the decision she had made. Or perhaps it was the realization that things could never be the same again. The house, which had once felt so alive with the energy of the parties, the laughter, the guests, now felt quieter. The sound of the ticking clock on the mantel seemed louder than it ever had before. Daisy had withdrawn into herself, her usual light-heartedness replaced with a distant sadness that I couldn't reach. And I knew no matter how much I tried to hold on to the illusion of the life we had built, that we were living in a lie. Gatsby had been right about that too. There was no going back. Daisy, in her silence, seemed to be mourning something. Perhaps it was the love she had once shared with Gatsby, the love that had been lost in the harsh reality of her life. Or maybe it was the realization that she had chosen security over passion, and now, standing in the aftermath, She was left with nothing but the emptiness of her choice. I tried to fill the silence with my own distractions. I threw myself into work, into the monotony of our routine. The only thing that kept me from sinking into the despair that I saw in Daisy's eyes was the understanding that I had won. Gatsby was gone. He had lost. I had won. But winning, I realized, meant nothing without the joy of knowing that Daisy was truly mine. And now I could see that she wasn't. Not really. She was mine in name, in title, in the life I had built for her, but not in the way I had always imagined. And then came the call that would change everything. It was the news that Gatsby had been killed. At first I didn't believe it. I thought it was some mistake, some strange rumor. But when I heard the details, when I heard the name George Wilson attached to it, it became clear that it was true. Gatsby, the man who had come into our world like a storm, had been shot dead in his own home. It seemed almost poetic in a way. His dream had ended as violently as it had begun. And in the end, he had died alone, just as he had lived. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. There was no sense of victory, no relief. The moment I had been waiting for, the moment when Gatsby's dream would collapse, had arrived. But it left me with nothing, just a hole where my triumph should have been. For the first time, I realized the true cost of what I had done. I thought of Daisy. I thought of how she would react when she heard the news. Would she mourn him? Would she regret her decision? Would she finally see that the man she had loved was dead because of the choices we had made? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should go to her, if I should console her, or if I should let her feel the weight of her own guilt. But I knew one thing for sure: this was the end of something, not just for Gatsby, but for all of us. The dream we had all been chasing, the dream that had defined our lives, was gone, and we were left with the ashes. Daisy didn't seem surprised when I told her the news. In fact, she seemed relieved. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand that she feel something, anything, but instead I stood there watching her as the silence between us grew. Eventually she spoke. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said quietly. "I never wanted this to happen." I nodded, but the words didn't seem to matter. What did it mean to apologize for something that couldn't be fixed? What did it mean to mourn a man who had spent his life chasing an illusion that had now died with him? The funeral came and went, and still nothing changed. The people who had once flocked to Gatsby's mansion, who had reveled in the excess and the spectacle of his life, did not show up. His death, like his life, was forgotten by those who had used him. Only a few people attended Nick Carraway, of course, and a few others who had been involved in Gatsby's world. But Daisy and I, we didn't go. We stayed in our house, continuing with our lives as though nothing had happened, as though nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. As the days passed after Gatsby's death, the world seemed to grow heavier. Life, it seemed, had continued its march forward, indifferent to the loss of a man who had so desperately tried to shape it. The parties at the mansion stopped, the lights went out, and the guests who had once filled the halls with laughter and empty chatter were now nothing more than ghosts in the periphery of my mind. Their fleeting presence had meant nothing, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that Gatsby too had been nothing more than a brief, flickering moment in a world that moved on without hesitation. I couldn't help but wonder what Gatsby's final thoughts had been. Was he filled with regret as the bullet tore through his life? Did he finally see that the dream he had chased, the one that had consumed him for so many years, was always destined to fade? Or was he still clinging to the hope that somehow, in some way, Daisy would return to him? I will never know the answer. What I do know is that his life and his death left a gaping wound in the fabric of everything I had believed in. Daisy, for her part, was silent. She had never been particularly vocal about her feelings, but in the wake of Gatsby's death, her silence seemed to stretch on endlessly. It was as though the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders and she had no idea how to bear it. I watched her in those days, the way she moved about the house, as if everything around her was nothing more than a blur. She didn't mourn for Gatsby, not really. Instead, she seemed to mourn for something else, something deeper that she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the realization that the man she had once loved, the man who had been a part of her youth, was gone. Or maybe it was the crushing weight of her own choices, the knowledge that the life she had chosen had led her to this moment, this point of no return. Whatever it was, I could feel it, pressing down on us both. We were trapped in a house full of memories that could never be erased, surrounded by a past that refused to stay buried. I couldn't escape it. The house felt colder, emptier. The grand halls that had once echoed with laughter now felt like hollow chambers, empty echoes of a life that had slipped away from us. I thought of Gatsby, and I thought of Daisy. I thought of how he had tried to make something of himself, to build a life that could rival mine, a life that could win her heart. But in the end, he had failed. He had failed because he had believed in something that was never meant to be. As for me, I wondered if I had failed as well. I had built a life, a family, a reputation. I had everything a man could ask for: wealth, power, security. But in the end, I had lost Daisy, not to Gatsby, but to the very world I had created. Daisy had never really been mine, not in the way I had always believed. She was a prize I had won, a symbol of my success, but not a woman I had ever truly understood. And now I was left with nothing but the remnants of a dream that had long since faded. I tried to reach out to her, to speak to her, to comfort her in some way. But she was distant, she was lost in herself, in a world of regret and uncertainty. The woman I had married, the woman I had once loved, was no longer the same. She had changed, and so had I. And though we still shared the same house, still shared the same life, I knew deep down that we were no longer connected in the way we had once been. I could see it in her eyes. There was a sadness there, a deep, lingering sadness that would not go away. And I knew, without a doubt, that Daisy would never return to me in the way I had hoped. She had made her choice long ago, and it wasn't me. But there was something else, something that gnawed at me, even as I tried to push it away. I couldn't help but wonder if, in some twisted way, Gatsby had won. Not in the way he had imagined, of course, but in a way that I couldn't deny. He had gotten closer to Daisy than I ever had. He had captured her attention, her heart, and in the end, it was he who had left the lasting impression on her, not me. I had everything, and yet I had lost everything. Gatsby had nothing, and yet in his pursuit of Daisy, he had everything he needed. He had the one thing that I could never have: her heart, her devotion, and that, in the end, was the cruelest irony of all. In the weeks that followed, Daisy and I fell back into the rhythm of our life as if nothing had changed. The funeral was a quiet affair, with only a handful of people attending, none of whom had any real connection to Gatsby. The guests who had once filled his mansion had moved on to other distractions, other parties, other lives. And Daisy and I? We continued as we always had, moving through the motions of our existence, without ever really confronting the truth of what had happened. The more I thought about Gatsby, the more I realized how much of a fool he had been. He had built his life on a dream, a fantasy that had never truly existed. And in the end, he had paid the price for that dream. But it wasn't just his dream that had died, it was ours. The dream of love, of perfection, of the future we thought we could have. Daisy had given that up for the security of a life she could never leave, a life that had never truly been hers to begin with. But I still didn't know how to fix it. How could I? How could any of us? Gatsby had died for nothing, for a love that could never be returned, for a life that he had built out of false promises and empty hopes. And Daisy, she was left behind, haunted by the past, unable to move forward. And so we lived on, Daisy and I, trapped in a life that had become a hollow shell of what it once was. Gatsby was gone, but his legacy lingered, haunting us both. In the end, we were all trapped in our own illusions, unable to escape the past, unable to let go of the things we had built and the things we had lost. It wasn't long after Gatsby's death that I realized just how deeply the shadow of that man had stretched over our lives. Daisy seemed to shrink further into herself, retreating into the comfort of her silence. She rarely spoke about him anymore, though I could feel the weight of his absence in every room of our house. But it wasn't just her. It was everyone. The people who had once flocked to Gatsby's parties, the socialites who had praised his wealth, his charm, his grandeur, had quickly forgotten him. His death was nothing more than a fleeting news story, a momentary blip in the world that moved on without so much as a second thought. At first, I tried to pretend that everything was fine, that we could continue with our lives as though nothing had happened. I took up my usual distractions, focusing on my business, spending time with my old friends as if the world I had built was unshakable. But even I couldn't deny that something inside me had changed. Gatsby had been a symbol of something I thought I understood, a man who had built himself from nothing, a man who had chased after the American dream, and yet, in the end, he had lost. The dream had killed him, and I couldn't help but wonder if the dream I had been chasing for all these years had killed me too. It was Daisy's indifference that bothered me the most. She had barely spoken about Gatsby after his death, almost as if she had already forgotten him. But I knew better. I knew she hadn't forgotten him. She couldn't. He had been the love of her life, the man who had captured her heart in a way I never had. And even though she had chosen me, even though she had stayed with me all these years, I knew that her heart still belonged to him. I had always thought that my wealth, my status, and my power were enough to keep her. I had always believed that the life I had built for us was the life she wanted, but Gatsby had shown me the truth. He had shown me that love wasn't something that could be bought or earned. It was something that could only be given freely, without expectation, without the constraints of society or wealth or ambition. And that was the one thing I could never give her. As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daisy was slipping away from me. She was still here, physically, but she was no longer the woman I had married. The woman who had once looked at me with love in her eyes, the woman who had stood beside me through thick and thin, was now a stranger. She was lost in a world of her own, a world where Gatsby still lingered, where the dreams of youth and love still held sway. But I couldn't change it. I couldn't make her love me in the way I wanted her to. I couldn't bring back the past, no matter how much I tried. And so I did what I always did. I buried it. I buried my feelings, buried my doubts, and tried to move on. I continued with my life just as I had before, but everything felt different now. The house felt emptier, the days longer, the nights colder. I looked at Daisy and saw the distance in her eyes, the same distance that had been there before we even met. And I realized, with a heavy heart, that I had never really known her at all. I had only known the version of her that I had wanted to know, the version that fit into my world, the version that was mine. But Daisy was never really mine. She had always belonged to herself, and I had been fool enough to think that I could own her. As the months wore on, I found myself increasingly restless. The life I had built was a shell, a mask that I had put on to protect myself from the truth. Gatsby's death had stripped away the layers of illusion I had so carefully constructed. The world I had lived in, the world of wealth and privilege, suddenly felt hollow. I had spent years chasing after something I thought I could control, something I thought I could possess. But now, as I sat in my study, staring out over the green hills that stretched out before me, I realized the harsh truth. I had never really been in control at all. Daisy and I continued to live together, but it was as if we were strangers, bound by obligation rather than love. There were no more passionate moments between us, no more shared laughter. The house was quiet, save for the occasional sound of the clock ticking in the distance. Daisy had become a ghost, a shadow of the woman I had once known. And I too had become a ghost in my own life, drifting through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that the dream we had built was still alive. But it wasn't. It never had been. I had spent so much of my life chasing after something that was always out of reach. And in the end, I had lost it all. Gatsby had been right about one thing: dreams are fragile things. They burn bright for a time, but eventually they fade. And when they fade, they leave nothing but ashes. As I sat in the quiet of my study, the realization hit me like a wave. Daisy was gone, not physically, but emotionally, and I had no one left. I had built my entire life around a dream, and now that dream had died. And in its place was nothing. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of Gatsby's death continued to haunt me. Not just the loss of the man himself, but the loss of everything he had come to represent. Gatsby was a man who had built his entire life on the belief that love could conquer all, that ambition and dreams could be realized through sheer willpower. But in the end, he had been wrong. The dream had destroyed him, just as it had destroyed so many before him. Daisy, too, was living in the aftermath of that shattered dream. She seemed quieter now, less vibrant. I could see the toll it had taken on her and both of us. She had chosen me, but in doing so, she had given up something far more precious: the ideal of love, the passion of youth, the dreams we all had before we grew disillusioned by the weight of reality. We both knew the truth, though we didn't speak it aloud. Daisy had married me out of convenience, out of a sense of duty, not because she had ever truly loved me. And I had married her because I had wanted to possess her, because she had been a symbol of everything I wanted to achieve. But in the end, she was never mine, and I was never truly hers. I started to spend more time outside, walking the grounds of our estate, trying to find some semblance of peace. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the nagging sense of emptiness that followed me. The laughter, the excitement, the passion that had once filled our lives had disappeared, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. The house that had once been filled with joy now felt oppressive, suffocating. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something that could never be replaced. I looked at Daisy, at the way she moved through the house, her face always clouded with the weight of unspoken thoughts. She was a woman torn between two worlds, between the life she had chosen with me and the life she had lost with Gatsby, and I could see that the past was still haunting her. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, I knew the truth. We were both trapped in a life we had built on lies, on dreams that could never come true. It was then that I began to question everything. Was this the life I had wanted? Was this what I had spent my entire existence chasing? I had built my wealth, my status, my reputation, but at what cost? I had lost the only thing that mattered. The truth. The truth of who we really were, the truth of what we really wanted, and the truth of what we had sacrificed to get here. I stood by the window, looking out at the green fields that stretched out before me. The world seemed so small, so insignificant from where I stood. The wealth, the power, the influence, none of it mattered anymore. What had it all been for? I had spent so much time trying to create a life that I thought would bring me happiness. And yet here I was, standing in a mansion full of memories, full of regrets. I thought of Gatsby again, of his relentless pursuit of a dream that had led him to his death, of the way he had believed that wealth could buy love, that success could erase the past. But in the end, he had been wrong, and so had I. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of my life had been a lie. How much of what I had built had been based on illusions, on the belief that if I just worked hard enough, if I just kept climbing the ladder, I could have everything I ever wanted. But in the end, I had lost it all. Daisy, too, was trapped. She had married me, thinking that we could build a life together, thinking that our love would be enough to make everything else fall into place. But she had been wrong. She had chosen the security of a life with me, a life filled with wealth and privilege, but she had given up something much more important, the chance to live a life of her own choosing. I thought about Gatsby's dream again. His dream of Daisy, his dream of a life that had never really existed. It was a dream that had driven him to build his empire, to change his name, to reinvent himself. And in the end, it had destroyed him. He had given everything to a dream that could never come true. I realized with a sudden clarity that I too had been living a dream of love, of success, of control. But it was a dream that had never been real, and now, like Gatsby, I was left with nothing but the ruins of what I had built. Daisy and I no longer spoke of the past. We didn't need to. The ghosts of our former lives haunted us both in silence. We were living in a world of empty promises and broken dreams, and there was no way out. The days passed, each one blending into the next, until they all seemed like one long blur. Daisy and I still existed in the same space, but it was as if we were two strangers living under the same roof. The love we once shared had faded, replaced by something darker, something colder. The security I had offered her, the comfort of wealth, the stability of a life with me had become a cage, trapping us both in a reality that neither of us could escape. Daisy still wore the same beautiful clothes, still went to the same events, still held her position in society. But none of it mattered. She had everything a woman could want, but nothing she truly needed. She had the life I had given her, but she didn't have the one thing that would have made her whole, her own happiness. I thought about how Gatsby had tried to give her that happiness, how he had tried to buy her love with his wealth, with his grand gestures, but in the end, he had failed, and so had I. We were both trapped in a world of our own making, a world that offered no escape. Daisy was no longer the woman I had married. She had become a shadow of herself, lost in the ghost of a dream that could never be realized. And I too had become a shadow lost in the lies I had told myself about what I wanted, about what I needed. In the quiet of the house, I realized that nothing would ever change. The dream I had built for us had died, just as Gatsby's had, and there was nothing left but the emptiness that remained. I couldn't help but reflect on how the world I had built had collapsed in front of me, despite all my efforts to maintain control. As the days slipped by, it became clearer that the facade I had carefully constructed over the years was nothing more than that facade. My wealth, my power, my position, none of it mattered in the end. Daisy, the woman I had worked so tirelessly to keep by my side, was slipping further and further away from me. Not physically, no. She was still here, still my wife in the eyes of the world. But emotionally, she was already gone. I had spent so much of my life chasing after the illusion of control, trying to bend the world to my will. But I had never truly understood the fragility of the things I held most dear. I had believed that wealth could buy everything, that power could make me untouchable, that if I just worked hard enough, I could keep my family, my life, my future in my grasp. But no matter how much I had, I was never in control. Not really. I had spent all this time building a life for Daisy and me, but I had never taken into account the one thing I couldn't control: her heart. I had wanted to believe that she was mine, that I could protect her from the world, from men like Gatsby. But now I understood. I had been so focused on keeping her in my life, on keeping our world intact, that I never once stopped to think about whether she was happy. Daisy was trapped, just as I was, trapped by the life we had built, trapped by the expectations of society, trapped by the roles we had played for so long. She had settled for me, not because she loved me more than anyone else, but because it was easier, because I had given her everything she needed, but nothing she wanted. And in the end, I had been the one who had betrayed her. Not Gatsby, not Tom. Number. It was me. I had been so determined to keep her for myself, to keep our life intact, that I had never given her the freedom to choose for herself. She had never asked for this life, never asked to be my wife, never asked to be a part of the world I had built for her. I had forced her into a role she never wanted to play, and now I was paying the price. I thought of Gatsby again, and the more I thought about him, the more I realized how similar we were. He had wanted to change his past, to build a new life for himself, to make Daisy love him again. But just like me, he had been trapped by his own illusions. He had believed that wealth and status could erase the past, that he could build the life he wanted with a single-minded obsession. But the reality was much harsher. You can't undo the past. You can't create a future based on a dream that was never real. Gatsby had spent his life chasing a shadow, and in the end it had destroyed him, and I had done the same. I had spent my life chasing control, trying to create the perfect life for Daisy, for myself, for us. But the truth was, the life I had built was never real. It was just a dream. And now Daisy and I were left with the remnants of that dream, a life that we could never fully live. The house felt emptier now. The silence between Daisy and me had become unbearable. We no longer spoke of the past, no longer talked about Gatsby, no longer acknowledged the truth that hung between us like a thick fog. I didn't know what to say to her, and I didn't think she knew how to talk to me either. The distance between us had grown, and there was nothing I could do to bridge that gap. We were both living in a world of our own making, a world where everything was meant to be perfect, but nothing ever truly was. The dream I had built for us was just a hollow shell, and I had finally realized that nothing I did could ever make it real. We were stuck in the past, and the future was something neither of us could reach. As I stood by the window, watching the sun set over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had wasted my life. I had chased after everything that didn't matter: wealth, power, control, and in doing so, I had lost the one thing that mattered most: Daisy. I thought of Gatsby once more, the man who had been so determined, so driven by a singular goal. He had given everything for a dream that was never meant to be, and in the end, he had paid the ultimate price. And I wondered as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, whether I too had paid the price for a dream that was never meant to come true. The weeks that followed were marked by a strange kind of silence. Daisy and I existed together, but it was as though we were living in parallel worlds, unable to bridge the gap that had formed between us. She never spoke of Gatsby, and neither did I. The world we had known was no longer there, and yet we carried on, trapped in a life that no longer felt real. I spent my days buried in work, retreating to my office where I could focus on anything to distract me from the gnawing emptiness that had taken root in my soul. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing, something I had never truly understood until it was too late. Daisy too had retreated into herself. She went through the motions of our life, but there was no spark in her eyes, no joy in her smile. She was a woman who had given up on the dream we had once shared, a woman who had settled for the life I had provided, even though it had never been what she truly wanted. I could see it in the way she moved through the house, in the way she looked at me with a sadness that seemed to grow each day, and I wondered if she would ever be happy, if she would ever find what she was looking for in this life. But I couldn't answer that, and neither could she. So we lived on, trapped in the silence of a life that had become too heavy to carry, too filled with regret and unspoken words. I had built this world, but it was no longer the world I wanted. It was no longer the world Daisy wanted, and yet we continued because there was nothing else to do. The silence stretched on. The illusion of control slipped further away. And we were left with nothing but the remnants of a dream that had never been meant to last. As the weeks bled into months, the silence in the house grew louder until it became impossible to ignore. Daisy and I no longer shared the same space, not in any meaningful way. She was there, physically of course, but emotionally we were both drifting in separate directions. Every conversation felt like an effort, an attempt to fill the void between us with meaningless words. We spoke about trivial things, whether to replace the curtains in the living room, which social engagements we should attend, but never once did we confront what had really happened, what we had lost. There were moments when I could almost hear the echo of Gatsby's name in the quiet corners of our house, but I couldn't bear to say it aloud. Daisy had stopped mentioning him altogether. I wondered sometimes if she regretted her choice. If the distance between us, the unspoken truth that hung like a thick fog in the air, was too great for her to cross. Was she happy? Did she feel as empty as I did? Or was it just me, alone in my thoughts, wallowing in a sorrow I had never learned to name? I spent more time away from her, retreating to my office or wandering the streets of West Egg, as if I could find something out there that could fill the void inside of me. But no matter where I went, the feeling of emptiness followed. I realized, perhaps for the first time, that no amount of wealth or social standing could give me the sense of peace I was seeking. I had spent my life accumulating riches, convincing myself that success was the answer to everything, but now all of it seemed insignificant. My wealth, my power, everything I had built, it felt like a hollow shell, a collection of things that looked impressive on the outside, but meant nothing in the end. Gatsby had shown me that. His dream, so pure, so innocent at first, had led him down a path of destruction. He had built his life on the idea that love, success, and wealth could be bought, but in the end, it had all been a fantasy, a false promise that crumbled when faced with the harsh light of reality. Daisy and I had lived our own version of that fantasy, hadn't we? I had worked so hard to create the perfect life for us, but now I realized that the life I had built wasn't real. It was based on illusions of control, of security, of love. But none of it had been enough, and now all that was left was the quiet pain of realizing that nothing could ever fix what had been broken. One afternoon, as I sat in the drawing room, watching Daisy move about the house, I felt a sudden wave of despair wash over me. She was sitting at the piano, her fingers brushing over the keys absent-mindedly, and for a moment I could almost see her as she once was young, carefree, full of promise. But that version of her was gone, just as the version of me who had once been so sure of everything had disappeared, too. I wondered in that moment if we were both just prisoners of our own making. Prisoners of our dreams, our desires, our illusions. Daisy had chosen me, yes, but had she ever truly wanted the life I had given her? And had I ever wanted the life I had built? Or had I too been chasing a dream, a fantasy that I thought would bring me happiness, only to find that it had led me nowhere? The truth, I realized, was that neither Daisy nor I had ever truly known what we wanted. We had spent our lives searching for something, anything that would give us meaning, but in the end, we had only created a cage for ourselves, built on false promises and misguided hopes, and now, in the silence of our house, we were left with nothing but the remnants of a dream that had died long ago. I walked over to Daisy, standing silently behind her. She didn't acknowledge me at first, but I could feel her awareness of my presence, the weight of everything unsaid between us. I wasn't sure if she could hear it to the echo of the past, the hollow space where love once was. But I knew one thing for certain: we could never go back. We could never recapture what we had lost, because what we had was never real in the first place. It had always been an illusion, and now it was gone. I placed my hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort, but it felt empty. She looked up at me, and for a fleeting moment I saw something: regret, perhaps, or a fleeting recognition of the truth that neither of us could escape. But before I could say anything, before I could reach out and finally confront the truth, she turned away. And in that moment, I knew that we were both beyond repair. We had both lost the ability to love in any real, meaningful way. We had both become trapped by our dreams, by our illusions, by the lives we had built to satisfy expectations we didn't fully understand. And in the end, we were left with nothing but the quiet realization that we had wasted it all: our love, our time, our lives. I didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say.